international community cheering them on.
Thank you. I would just, I don't know if this, it is said that someone asked President Ahmadinejad, aren't you worried about the United States attacking? I mean, you're provoking them so much. And he said, no, they're not like us, they're rational.
Thank you. I'm Ronald Newman, I'm president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. See what you all have done to me? You've already boggled my mind. And formerly ambassador in Afghanistan. And I would add Afghanistan is another place where that can really make our life extraordinarily difficult. But I wanted to ask you to look forward a little bit. So far we've never had to do this because we've never gotten past the missed opportunity. But should we not have a war, and should we actually manage to get an opportunity started, these are going to be extraordinarily difficult talks to handle from every aspect. The splits within Iran that have caused them not to pick up talks before would still exist even if you have a regime that begins the talks. Will make it difficult for them to handle their end of talks. Our domestic political constituencies will make it very difficult here. If we overpromise at the beginning, the chances are it'll be unsustainable because results will not be quick. And I have no reason to believe the Iranians have become less adept as negotiators than they were when I first dealt with them. And looking at the document that has appeared of the Iranian offer, which I think is in both your books, there's some very tough stuff in there for us to handle. I mean, there are very hard issues of payments where there's a totally different view of what funds exist and what funds can be made available. There are requests for guarantees for U.S. positions, which would be extremely difficult to handle. Some pose the request for a turnover, reciprocal turnover of hostages poses huge, or hostages of prisoners, of terrorists, poses huge issues for us of law, both domestic law and international law. So there's a whole gamut of really, really tough issues to handle over a very long time in a situation in which for each country handling the domestic politics is as hard as handling the negotiation. And I'd really like to invite you to speculate a little bit or think for us how on each side would one handle such a negotiation so that you could sustain it to the point of actually having a result. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that's an excellent question. And certainly, I don't think anyone should be under the illusion that diplomacy is going to be quick or that it's going to be easy. It's going to be tremendously difficult. After all, there hasn't been really official discussions between the two countries in 28 years. So there's a lot of anger that's been piling up on both sides, a lot of difficulty. I do believe, however, that it would be instructive to inform the American public that, as Robert pointed out, that there's only a few choices. If we don't pursue diplomacy, we will either have to acquiesce or we have to go to war. And I think one of the biggest problems beyond the domestic scene is going to be that we would actually have to walk into and try to create a new paradigm for the Middle East. Because we have been pursuing a policy for the last 28 years, intensified in the last 15 years, in which we have sought an order in the Middle East based on Iran's exclusion. And that's an extremely difficult order to sustain, because it's basically saying we want to have a region in which we want stability, but the most powerful states of that region cannot be part of it. So the only way we can keep it alive is for us to put in all taxpayers' money and occasionally our troops to sustain it. And that's not sustainable anymore. I don't think we would have ever managed to get to a Europe today in which it is inconceivable to have war between Germany and France if we had pursued a European order based on Germany's exclusion. It would not be possible. And that's going to be a difficult pill to swallow, not just for the United States, but also for Israel and for many of the Arab states, particularly those in the Persian Gulf, who have grown accustomed to the fact that the huge giant to the north is being crippled and contained by the United States, and they've been able to pursue their policies almost as if Iran did not exist. That's going to be extremely difficult. But it's also going to be difficult for Iran, because at the end of the day, in order for this to work, Iran needs to accept a couple of things. One being that the United States is the world's sole superpower, and that it cannot pursue a policy in the region and expect a role in the region if it's continuing to try to be at odds with the United States for the sake of rallying support on the Arab Street. And it cannot expect to be included in the region if it continues to refuse to accept Israel's existence in the region as a fact as well. I don't know if I made it any easier. I just actually pointed out that even more difficult. By the book.
I have a few practical ideas. In Trita's book, he argues that Iran should have been invited to the Madrid peace conference that took place after the first Gulf War. I would argue that there's much more reason to invite Iran now than there was in 1991, because Iran is much more powerful in the region now, largely thanks to U.S. policies, which have eliminated its major rivals in the region. So, this whole notion that Annapolis is the meeting of, of the moderates, of the reasonables, as Condi Rice calls them, ensures that it will fail, because reasonable people can come to a decision, and then the unreasonable people will blow it up. No matter what happens. So, if she manages to get Olmert and Abbas to agree to something, that's fine. But what about Hamas? What about Hezbollah? What about Iran? So you might start with a peace conference that actually included Iran. You could talk about, this is something that was discussed by Mohsen Rezai, who's the former commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. He wanted a new security architecture for the Gulf that would bring in the Saudi Arabia and the small Gulf countries, and Iran, and the United States, maybe Russia, on a regular basis to discuss security issues. There is no such security architecture for the Gulf now. There's the GCC, which is pretty ineffectual. And you want to make it interesting, ask Israel to come into it too. Make the Iranians sit down and talk to all those Parsi-speaking Israelis. So one to be creative. The other thing is that there was a possibility of back channel talks. It would have been nice if the administration perhaps begun that dialogue with Ali Larijani when he was more powerful than he is now. Perhaps given the tendency of both administrations to meet, that's really a non-starter, and so we should do something that has a big plenary meeting and then split off in groups and individuals talk to each other about different issues. Maybe that's the best way to do it.
A question over here?
I'm Al Richmond, former Office of Research in the State Department. I wanted to move, if the panel would move the discussion from regime change to government shift. As some have asserted that the present leadership of Iran is not interested in dialogue with the U.S. They're interested in playing off the U.S. So I want to ask your view of what is the possibility of the instability of the current leadership, and what we might do to help change it. Not regime change, but leadership change.
I was a Russian major in college, and I lived in the old Soviet Union, and I lived in China in the early 1980s. So again, I think that the value of U.S.-Iran reconciliation, particularly trying to get some American diplomats back in Iran, would be enormously helpful in terms of strengthening those forces within the country that would like to see reconciliation. I think the sanctions policy is working to some extent, particularly the banking sanctions, have created real economic hardship and are exacerbating splits within the regime. I would like to see sanctions but an unconditional offer to talk, something that would condition the Iranian political environment. They're going to have parliamentary elections in March and presidential elections in 2009. So if the U.S. plays its cards right, it actually could help to produce a change in government. Iran, this is a